war were detained, as well as in residential areas that were controlled by Russian armed forces. We also documented transfers of civilians to areas in occupied territory or to the Russian Federation, some of which may amount to forced transfers or deportations. These transfers include children and adults who lived in social care institutions and unaccompanied children from parts of Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Kiev and Odessa regions, while they were occupied by the Russian Federation or temporarily controlled by Russian armed forces. I will now turn to our report on the treatment of prisoners of war during all stages of captivity, from initial capture to transit and then places of internment. Our team interviewed more than 400 prisoners of war, approximately 200 on each side. Ukraine provided us with unimpeded, confidential access to official places of internment of Russian prisoners of war. The Russian Federation did not give us access. However, we were able to carry out confidential interviews with Ukrainian prisoners of war upon their release. I will start with Russian prisoners of war in the hands of Ukraine. We are deeply concerned about the summary execution of up to 25 Russian prisoners of war and persons hors de combat by Ukrainian armed forces, which we have documented. This was often perpetrated immediately upon capture on the battlefield. While we are aware of ongoing investigations by Ukrainian authorities into 5 cases involving 22 victims, we are not aware of any prosecution of the perpetrators. Almost half of the 222 Russian prisoners of war who we interviewed spoke of being tortured or ill-treated by members of Ukrainian armed forces and the SBU, and to a lesser extent penitentiary staff. The majority of these cases occurred during the initial stages of apprehension and interrogation. Prisoners of war were beaten, shot in the legs, stabbed in the limbs, electrocuted, subjected to mock executions, threats of sexual violence or death. In permanent places of internment, such as pre-trial detention facilities or the prisoner of war camp, reports of mistreatment were significantly less. We still received, however, complaints of beatings in some of these facilities in Dnipro, Vinnytsia and Kharkiv last spring. Under international law, prisoners of war should not be held in closed confinement. While many remain in closed confinement in Ukraine, we welcome progress through the establishment of a prisoner of war camp in Lviv, in the Lviv region in April 2022. We expect that the authorities are addressing complaints of humiliating and degrading treatment which we received during our visit to the camp in December 2022. No camp has been established in the Russian Federation, and PRWs are regularly held in close confinement there. In relation to the treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war, we are also deeply concerned by the summary execution of 15 Ukrainian prisoners of war shortly after of these executions. Of the 203 Ukrainian prisoners of war that we interviewed, 67% fell into the hands of the Russian forces after their surrender was negotiated by commanders. In these cases, we saw better protection for them at the beginning of their captivity. However, the majority of Ukrainian prisoners of war who were captured during battle were tortured or treated before internment. Members of Russian armed forces and the Russian security service tortured and ill-treated them to extract military information, to intimidate or humiliate them, or as a form of retribution. Forms of torture included beating, electrocution, or, in several cases, being shot or stabbed in the legs. Mock executions were also common. The report describes one case where a prisoner of war died from injuries within hours after he was tortured. Conditions for many Ukrainian prisoners of war were shocking. A prisoner of war we spoke to told us, and I quote, "We were provided with just enough food to keep us alive. Access to medical care was often insufficient or unavailable, sometimes leading to dire consequences. The report documents that 5 of them died in internment, reportedly due to the lack of medical attention. The number of documented cases of torture and ill treatment during internment in penitentiary facilities is shocking. More than 84% endured such mistreatment. Penitentiary staff subjected prisoners of war to so-called welcome beatings upon their arrival, beat and electrocuted them regularly during inspections in cells and while walking them around the facilities. Members of the Russian Federal Penitentiary Services and those in charge of many places of internment in Russian-occupied territory systematically engaged in such practices against prisoners of war. Former prisoners of war told our colleagues that they dreaded weekly trips to the shower, which inevitably ended in beatings and humiliation, often with sexual overtones. We documented that 5 prisoners of war died from injuries sustained during torture and internment. The cruelty and large-scale impact on civilians that we have seen over the last year will continue unless both parties to the conflict ensure full compliance with international humanitarian law. And when violations do occur, prompt action must be taken, first within the ranks of the army itself, and also through full and effective investigations and prosecutions of those responsible for the acts committed and those in command. The cases of summary executions, torture and ill treatment, arbitrary detention and sexual violence must not be allowed to continue. It is now over a year since the Russian Federation launched its armed attack against Ukraine, which has led to the violations that I have outlined today. In the words of our High Commissioner, we appeal again for respect for the sanctity of life, for human dignity, for respect for the principle of humanity. Thank you.
Colleagues, have we got any questions? We don't. Thank you.
Oh, it's a microphone.
Indra Sprāns, Latvijas Rādio. I'm wondering what legal route do you see? What legal route do you see as the best to bring those responsible for this to justice?
I can't hear you.
What legal route do you see to bring those responsible for justice?